why are the Middle Ages also called the Dark Ages, sometimes, especially in the English language? Well, it actually started as a metaphor in the 14th century by the Italian poet Francesco Petrarca, who was a great admirer of both Greeks and Romans, so of the ancient times. And he would compare those times with his own, and he found out he wasn't really that pleased with his current situation, and he complained a lot about the stormy times when he was living, and saying stuff like, when the darkness would be dispersed, then our descendants can come again in the former pure radiance. So he, as well as other Italian scholars in the 14th and 15th centuries, that was the time of the Renaissance, they were having this intellectual and artistic bloom and began to see themselves in the footsteps of the ancients that they were trying to revive. So they believed that time was a time of a reborn classical culture, and they were the ones who rescued Greek and Latin works from near oblivion. So these writers started to see history as divided in three phases, basically. So it was the classical age, the age of wisdom, and then there was the time when Jesus walked the earth, and then there was their own time, the time of the Renaissance, when things were supposed to get better. So in the meantime, all those centuries in between, especially from the fall of the Roman Empire just before their own time, became designated as the Dark Ages, and later on as the Medium Aevum, so the Middle Ages in Latin. So Italian scholars viewed this age as a time when everything seemed to be in decline, both culture, architecture, art, literature, anything you can think of. So the idea of the Middle Ages would spread to other history writers across Europe. However, the term Dark Ages stayed in the English language, and you're going to find a lot of references to this in the 17th and 18th centuries. So Edward Gibbon, for example, who speaks of the darkness of the Middle Ages, and it was a time generally portrayed as dominated by tyrants, barbarians, and superstition, so when nothing worthy ever happened. But ever since, up until nowadays, historians tend to regard that age as a little more nuanced than that, with characteristics and achievements and so on, and the Dark Ages rather designate nowadays that period when we actually don't have a lot of sources so that we can reconstruct history. So it was right after the fall of the Roman Empire. But characterizing this vast era of history as one of little cultural development and its peoples as uncivilized is a broad generalization that is frequently seen as inaccurate. In fact, one might say the Dark Ages never really occurred. Even the phrase lacking in sources still has a lot to offer. There were trained priests abroad, for example, who founded centers of learning like Canterbury. Charlemagne's court was full of learned people that ensured the survival of many Latin texts, and the Carolingian minuscule, the writing system, had innovations like punctuation, cases, spacing between words. It revolutionized reading and writing and facilitated the production of books and other documents. There was a huge manuscript tradition flourishing. Owning such works of art was a symbol of status. There was a lot of contact between cultures. Look at the coins from the Abbasid Caliphate which reached Europe or were copied. There was also a great scientific development like mechanical clocks or the heavy plough, not to mention the tremendous development of mathematics and medicine in the Islamic world. The Latin translation of the compendious book on calculation by completion and balancing by the 9th century Persian astronomer and mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, who lived in the 9th century, which introduced Europe to algebra. And speaking of which, the Middle Ages did happen elsewhere too. So we should also look at places like the Byzantine Empire or further away like the Tang dynasty to expand our horizons. The Byzantines, for example, borrowed elements of both Roman and Greek culture. They were of Greek descent, but they saw themselves as Romans, and their education included readings from classic Greek literature. In fact, it was not uncommon for Byzantine academics to flaunt their literary advancement by mimicking the archaic speech of classical writers like Sophocles and Plato or Herodotus. Byzantine academics also combed through old manuscripts, compiling helpful knowledge on a wide range of topics, from horsemanship to beekeeping, for encyclopedic reference books like the 10th century Constantinia excerpts. In the Islamic world, on the other hand, we have Baghdad, which was a cultural and political center that drew goods and people from 3 continents. It had a population of about 1 million people, and its greatest and most hallowed institution was the Bait al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, where you could read so much and so diverse, even the archaeological discussions on the pyramids of Giza, all written on paper. So that was pretty innovative. So yeah, during the Enlightenment in the 18th century, many intellectuals felt that the religious dogma of the Middle Ages did not really fit well with the emerging Age of Reason, which is why the term the Dark Ages became more popular. So they viewed the Middle Ages as dark in contrast to their own era, to the more cheerful eras of antiquity and the Renaissance they admired, and especially to the New Age, because of the dearth of records and especially the prominence of organized religion, which was seen with extreme skepticism. Now think about it, you may also giggle at your family's old photographs, attire, or roll your eyes at their songs and other habits. They must have come from a strange bygone era. That's what happened to scholars of new generations as well. So they frequently attempted to set themselves apart from those of previous generations, which is why we have this general eye rolling, very widespread. But we also need to own up to the fact that for historians who work primarily with texts, those centuries are indeed somewhat the lost centuries. But in this sense, like something very defined and rather with reference to chronology, sources, and a practical problem. So not used to portray the Middle Ages as unrefined, violent, without any cultural achievements whatsoever. The Dark Ages is, all in all, an obsolete term, and not only is it used pejoratively to talk about the Middle Ages, but it is also used in many other contexts and sometimes very misplaced as a form of manipulation to make certain groups of people, like the others, look worthy of contempt. So we should always pay attention when using this term and be aware of its implications. So what do you think? Have you ever used this term, the Dark Ages, and in what context? And do you think that the Middle Ages really deserve such a designation? Leave a comment below and subscribe if you enjoyed.